Seen this one?
No. I mean, the Quran by
Rodwell.
No, you've got some lovely. Wow, you really. But you haven't got you haven't studied Arabic yet, or are you studying Arabic?
No, I'm not studying Arabic.
Do it. Oh, salam alaikum. It appears we're live on Facebook. You've just seen a little bit of a background chat there. It's really nice when we get into people's living rooms. I think that's one of the bonuses for a bit of an interviewer, nosy Parker like me, Allah forgive me, is to have looked into people's lives and get to know a little bit how they are. So welcome. I'm here today with Julian Bond, a good friend to aboutislam.net and a soul seeker, I suppose. Julian, we're here today to talk about your journey with the Quran and how you're seeking, as someone who accepted Christianity as a teenager, to explain elements of the Quran to the wider world who may have biases about it. I'm going to greet you with the Islamic greeting of peace, and we always begin, of course, with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah.
Walaikum salam.
So tell us a little bit about your journey with the Quran and your interest in it, and how deep you're going into your journey right now.
Okay, so just before we started, I went and grabbed this one from the bookshelf. This is Rodwell's translation. He was the vicar at St Ethelburga's in the city of London in the 19th century. St Ethelburga's is now a centre for reconciliation and peace. I bought his translation when I was at university in Aberystwyth in 1985, and then it just sat on the bookshelf for 15 years. And I was looking for something to read on the commute to work when I was working for the Inland Revenue. So I read Rodwell's translation in 2000 on the way to work, and I was really intrigued. It's quite a strange translation because it's in sort of King James English, and he thought it would be a good idea to arrange the surahs, the chapters, chronologically, because he thought it might help, which is nice in one way because it starts with the angel confronting the Prophet Muhammad and saying, read. So you got all that at the beginning, and then gradually it goes through the whole. He had some issues with the text, so his footnotes are quite problematic and cheeky and worse. But having read it, I thought, okay, I have now read the Islamic scriptures, but I don't really know what Islam is about. So I went into early internet chat rooms and almost immediately started getting into religious arguments with people of various different positions. Nothing has changed. It was quite primitive then. But that set me up for when an opportunity came round on the email at work at the Inland Revenue for a secondment opportunity with the Archbishop's Christian Muslim Initiative. This was 2002. Because Tony Blair, I know you have a connection with him.
We know Tony, yeah.
Yes. He has his good parts and his bad parts, but one of his good things was being very supportive of what was Archbishop Carey's intention of doing something positive and constructive with and for British Muslim communities, or English Muslim communities, because it was within the scope of the Church of England. So 10 Downing Street said, okay, we will fund this and we will find a civil servant to work on this initiative. So
what was the point of it, Julian? What was the point to
So back in 1997, Archbishop Carey gave a dinner at Lambeth Palace for the Sheikh of Al-Asa. I can't remember which one, but so then he gave this speech where he said that, for paraphrasing and remembering not terribly well, that for the sake of society and for the Muslim community and for all that was involved in that, he wanted to do something nationally and publicly to bring Christians and Muslims together. And there was a series of conversations that took place from then until 2000, 2001 with leading Christians and Muslims of all sorts, very diverse, to explore how this might be done. And they came up with the idea of a listening exercise, which was to meet with Christians and Muslims in areas around England where there were significant numbers of Muslims locally. So London, Birmingham, Manchester, Blackburn, Bradford, Leicester. And that was the preparatory work. So I was seconded to that for 2 years, from 2002 to 2004. And we met with thousands of people and we asked them what they thought about this idea. But getting back to the Quran, so I'd read Rodwell once, maybe twice by then. Then about that time, I'd picked up Dawood's translation. So Dawood was an Iranian Jew. So he's done a translation. It's quite a slim volume, published by Penguin. I guess it's still out there. And so I was reading that at the time. And before I started on this secondment, I read it again because I thought, surely when I start meeting Muslims, the book is really important for them. There's going to be all kinds of conversations about the Quran. There weren't really, but there we go. But I was prepared.
We'll come back to that. So you read some quite obscure copies. Did the second one begin with Al-Fatiha? Because I wonder why not go to the one. I mean, I guess Allah Ta'ala chooses what our access points are, and you had to find it through your Englishness, if you like. So, for example, Britishness. Okay, I was given a copy of the Quran that was done in Oldie English, and it was done in poetry form. So the poetry was brought out not above the meaning, but along with it. And that, for me, being somebody who's performed Shakespeare, really flowed. For other people, that would be a barrier to engagement. So there you were engaging. You said something earlier about getting into arguments around that time in chat room. What were your bones of contention at that time?
Oh, I think it's basically around religious intolerance. So even back in 2000, as soon as you start talking about Islam or any other religion, then you begin to encounter people of a conservative background, so a conservative Christian background, who would have an issue with another Christian even just picking up scriptures belonging to another religion. And then it gets worse as you read it, as you meet with people, as you pray with them, if you let them into your house, if you even have the Quran in your house. These cause all kinds of issues. For some people, yes. I'm not saying that doesn't represent the whole of Christianity, but there's some very hardline anti-Muslim, anti-Islam views out there. And once you get into the scene, interfaith engagement, then you begin to encounter them. And of course, there's all the stuff that's going on that we, like Tommy Robinson, for example, the EDL and other things.
Those are the obvious purveyors of anti-Muslim hatred. I wonder about your questions at that point about intolerance. So you were getting into arguments with people who were saying, from no basis of knowledge, the Quran teaches everybody to kill. And were you defending or dissecting different elements? Because obviously you'd read an English translation of the Quran, but it's an approximation, isn't it?
I don't think I was getting into those conversations, but it probably would have been around the whole question of openness and me being a very liberal kind of person in my outlook, open-minded, pluralistic, universalist. Once I get into those spaces, I'm bound to have a disagreement, and I will post things which people will have a problem with.
You now run several hashtags, Quran tweets and how to read the Quran, and you have a really great blog on Medium, and I hope inshallah we'll be posting links to those below this video for aboutislam.net. Tell me how you are accessing the Quran now, not through the Arabic, but through the English. And what is your messaging on these hashtags? And why? I've got 3 questions. Why the Quran in English? What are your main messages, and who are you trying to reach?
Okay, those are all good questions, but I want to step back a bit. So
Sure.
the whole thing about the Quran was the link with Ramadan. So once I started working in this area of interfaith, then it wasn't long before I encountered the various practices that are part of Ramadan. And so I think the first was in sort of November 2002. That was the first time I encountered it, and I did a day of fasting or semi-fasting. And then I got into the practice, the habit of reading the Quran every Ramadan. And so it's not, my exploration hasn't just been with the text, but also with the practice. And each year I've looked at, well, more recently, looked at different ways of engaging with it. Let's see. So after the Archbishop's Initiative, which finished in 2004, I went back to the Inland Revenue. But then at the beginning of 2006, I joined the Christian Muslim Forum as its first director. The forum was what came out of the initiative. And each year we would send a greeting to the Muslim community. I'm not going to say English Muslim communities because it was on the internet, so it was everywhere. We would send a greeting for the beginning of Ramadan, and we would send an Eid message at the end. So that was part of normal working life, to be engaged with and having Muslim colleagues and fasting alongside them some of the time. The whole thing about when is Ramadan starting, so the communities never quite seem to agree on which is the start, and then when are we celebrating Eid. So I suppose the first year that it got particularly interesting was back in 2013 when Naveed Akhtar was putting together, I can't remember the title, short Ramadan interviews on Channel 4 with various people of all different faiths and backgrounds. And I think that's brought that sense of being more deeply involved in it through being on screen talking about it. The forum was based in Bethnal Green at that time, so very close to the Muslim community, closer than when we started, and the office was based in other places. And then following that, I think what stands out, the year after I left, or even just a few months after I left, I was talking to a Muslim friend who said that she couldn't fast for health reasons. So I had this idea, and some might think it's a crazy idea, that we would find people who would do fasts for our Muslim friends who weren't able to fast. I did have a scholar challenging me on that one. But
because their fast is still valid, obviously it's acceptable if you're ill. But I guess your feeling then with the English Muslim Forum and afterwards is about what can I do to be a part of the wider religious community. You know what, in your work, in your medium writings, you choose the word God. So you've done a straight kind of English pull for the word, because Allah is the one, it's his first name, it's the main name, and God is a very loose translation. Did you have to wrestle about using the word Allah and giving the true diversity in your explorations? Because when we call something, for example, how to read the Quran, and then we're not using the word Allah, do you think it's missing something without that? What was your thinking there?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and this is all about sort of boundaries and labels and demarcation and confusion and various other things. So it doesn't make any difference to say God or Allah.
That's questionable. That it doesn't if you're a Christian.
Okay, fair enough. But in British society, where the majority language is English, and even for those whose first language is not English, this is how we're communicating. And one of the issues in this interreligious space, or the space where different views and beliefs and worldviews are encountering Islam, is the perception or the propaganda or whatever it is that Allah is some kind of foreign, made up, or worse kind of being. And if you talk about Allah, then you're talking about someone or some being who is different from God as commonly understood in the European context. And when you are in a space or a role which is encouraging understanding and encounter, then there's a certain amount of caution about what language you use and what names you use. So some of the people who might be in the interfaith space, they would be put off if the Christian organizers were talking about Allah all the time, unfortunately.
Well, what's interesting, I think, in the interfaith space is that there are Muslims there and there are Christians there, and so powerful words. I'm thinking about the wonderful writings that you do on things like who is Satan in the context of the Muslims and the Christians, and about Al-Anfal and war, and that very difficult, for some people, difficult ayat, which we can talk about, which you've written about, and you put into context really, really in a tight way. I haven't heard it kind of put into such good, I think, tight English. So the word Allah is something that people are afraid of. But I think when we write about beauty and love, Allah says this. Does that not arguably, really awaken in people? Oh, this Allah is a pretty lovely creator. So
I think
anyway,
it does. I think it does.
Thought of a link that we might be missing there.
Yeah, and as time has gone on and I've got away from that sort of formal, boundaried, official kind of interfaith, I've been able to be more free about it. But even in one of the early blogs, I do address this question, if you like, of Allah. And there's a sort of pull-out quote in one of the blogs which says, Allah is my God is Allah. Because we're talking about the same thing. There's some theology around it.
That must have been very powerful when you decided to put that out there. Knowing people that there'd be resistance from your people, from the people you work with, from people who know you as a Christian. Or was there no resistance? Was it very fluid?
I don't recall getting any resistance, but the interesting thing, so I'm not sure if we're going to answer your original 3 questions, but my original idea, building on all the other things that have been going on in Ramadan, so engaging with the community, engaging with the text and reading it, and sharing from that. So the hashtag Quran tweets was going on earlier, and that was just, I would find a particularly interesting verse, either in its own right or because it was very close to a biblical verse. So I'd tweet it as I was reading and use the hashtag. What was happening then technologically is you could set your Twitter account so anything that you post on Twitter would end up on Facebook as well. That's now gone for whatever reason. And but the good thing about Facebook is that it reminds you what was happening a year ago. So now, 4 years after I started tweeting all those things, each day more of them will come up. And if it's in the sort of Ramadan period between April this year and June, July 4 years ago, then there's this window when all these texts are coming up for me pretty much every day. So then I can retweet them again each year as they come up. It'd be nice if Twitter had that, but and you can if you're really good with the search engine, you can do that. So that was the beginning, sort of picking up on the reading and the tweeting, and then later into the reflecting and writing about it. The English question. So I studied Greek and Hebrew as part of my theology degree back in the 1980s, but of course I've forgotten nearly all of it now. I guess that I could learn Arabic if I had sufficient time and commitment, and maybe wasn't doing too many other things, and maybe if I was in a Muslim country for an extended period.
But you know lots of Arabic words, so if I said to you, Insha'Allah,
God willing.
God willing, and Bismillah.
In the name of God.
There you go. Alhamdulillah.
Thanks be to God, or praise to God.
There you go. Subhanallah. I know that I get the feeling that you know these because you've been writing and wanting to know them. And for me,
but not just the writing, because that's not. So we've been talking about working and reading and writing, but I've been going to mosques ever since 2002. So many years sitting at the back while the prayers are going on, having some occasions with colleagues to ask, well, what does it mean in the prayer when you say Sami Allahu liman hamida? God listens to those who praise God. And the response, Rabbana lakal hamd. It did take me a long time to memorize Al-Fatiha, which I'm not going to recite now. So picking up from the practice and sitting with people. So I suppose one of the questions that you've probably got up your sleeve is who was on this journey with me. So one of them was an imam, Musa Admani. He's the Muslim chaplain at London Metropolitan University. I don't know if he's still there, he might be. I feel that my journey of reading the Quran is similar in some ways to his. So I do tell his story from time to time. He studied at the seminary in Deoband, famously where the Taliban studied. And I used to meet up with him, and he'd be at some of the interfaith events that I used to go to.
Can we just stop there? Talib, by the way, meaning student. So there's an automatic there that the English language makes because of news. Talib just means student. So it's a student gathering.
It's an innocent word which has got all this baggage attached to it. But he would meet people, or he would get into the Q&A session, and he say something like, I used to be one of the Taliban. But he had a very powerful encounter with the text when he was at the seminary, and I think they were reading Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah 2, which talks about, in the early verses, those who believe in the unseen. There's a list of different types of people who believe or think various things. Those who believe in the unseen is one of those characteristics. And suddenly it sort of blew his mind and opened it up to anyone who believes in the unseen is included in this group. Anyone who is open and isn't just in the everyday, they are on this path, they're included in this group. And he began to see the Quranic text as being radically inclusive and pluralist. And some of us share those views about the text. So typically what we hear, and we tend to hear loud, extreme, or very conservative voices. We get lines being drawn, boundaries, and saying this is right and this is the right path, this is the wrong path, for example. But not what I think is what the Quran is trying to tell us about something which is inclusive and pluralist, because that makes sense within the context of Tawheed, divine unity, the unity of everything. And Amina Wadud talks about this, how everything exists within Tawheed. So he had this open-minded perspective on the text. And I got into it so I was reading the Quran a lot, and I was reading it alongside the work and was hoping to have conversations with members of the community, but was also getting into conversations and arguments with conservative groups within the Christian community. So as I was engaging with Muslims, I was engaging with Christians who didn't agree with me, who didn't take the same stance. So they would pick out difficult verses. But once you read the book and you read the whole chapter and you get a sense for how it fits together, even though it's not chronological like the Bible, that you can see what's going on in a way which, if you listen to Tommy Robinson, for example, or other people, you don't get, because you're being forced into a framework which is based on these cherry-picked verses. Whereas if you're open to the text, you can see and feel what's going on. So the idea with the blog series was to take those many years of conversation, exposure to the text, of being at events, listening to Muslim speakers, sitting with imams. So my friend Musharraf Hussain, who produced the translation recently, I sat in his masjid with him and we were reading Surah Yusuf together. So I had the Bible, he had the Quran in Arabic, and he also had his English translation, and we were comparing between Genesis and Surah Yusuf. So those are the things which are feeding in.
Please do give us a few insights into, say, some specifics about Surah Yusuf, because as Muslims, we understand that there is so much added information. You know, that Tawheed is a step-by-step process bringing us to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, to understand the fullness of the final message. Those are, as Muslims, we understand that. So there's some information in those books, and then more information and finalized information that's been protected in the Quran. So in Surah Yusuf, compared to what more did you learn, or what more can you take away, and what more can you discuss with Christians?
I'd have to get the text out and go through it, but basically what you've got in the Bible is about 4 chapters or so, which tell the main parts of this. No, it's more than that, more like 10 chapters, which takes the story. In the Quran, in Surah Yusuf, you've got the longest continuous story, which takes up a whole surah, whole chapter, and it follows the biblical sequence of events, and it is very similar. So the things that are in the biblical story are in the Quranic story, and it's great to read them together. It's really easy, and it's a great introduction for anyone who says, well, the Quran is a completely different book, it's got nothing to do with the Bible. I think what does come out very strongly is the divine inspiration and divine knowledge that Joseph's father, Yaqub, has, where he knows what is going on as it's happening, and he knows what's going to happen. So he's suspicious of his other sons when they say, oh, let Joseph come with us. Because they are plotting against him. And Jacob knows all about it. And when they come back and they bring Joseph's coat, which has got blood on it, he knows that it's not Joseph's. He knows that they're doing some kind of trickery and that they're not telling him the whole story. So their story is that he was killed by wild animals. So he knows that that's not happened. And throughout the story, he's, from a human level, you can say he's suspicious of his sons as they're coming back and telling him all these things. But from the divine standpoint, he's got this knowledge from God. And that is one of the particulars of the Quran. So God saying repeatedly, I know the things that you don't know. And God's going to clear everything up at the end. And that's the self-consciousness of the text, if you like, knowing that it is of a piece and that it is from a divine perspective, which doesn't match up with all of the Bible in terms of a standpoint.
There is absolutely that self-awareness that all time is one for Allah Ta'ala, the creator of everything. Everything is happening in this instant, and he is connected and in control of it. One of the main points for Christians is Tawheed versus or as opposed to Trinitarianism, which wasn't a factor for the original Christians. The original Christians were monotheists, and that came in later on as a belief. You, in your Medium blog, you write very interestingly about Surah Ikhlas. Surah Ikhlas, for everybody, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in English, is He is Allah, the unique, Allah the eternal. He is not a father nor a son, none is equal to him. And that for any believer, any seeker, settles the heart and says, oh, it all makes sense now. If we're called towards Tawheed, and you wrote that that God doesn't speak or do theology because that's the technicality in which we understand faith, and that this is a part, however, where that Christians can't really bind together with the Quran. I mean, that's it, isn't it? Allah is very clear here. How did you find it coming across that verse?
Yeah, well, it's not the only verse. There's the one which says, say not three, and say not that Allah is the Messiah. And I think there's a couple of references where God speaks directly to Jesus, Isa, in the Quran, and says something like, confirm that you didn't ask your followers to worship you and your mother, and other things.
Though that's a very weighty one. That one, when I read that actually makes me cry, because also I was reading today the Sermon on the Mount, which is a collection of Isa alayhi salam, peace be upon him's teachings, and there, and I'd forgotten this from my time as a Christian, that Isa alayhi salam says there will come to you people who say on the last day, weren't we with you? And you'll say, you're nothing to do with me. That's in the Quran. So how does that hit you with the Trinitarianism, and have you settled on Tawheed as oneness as a way of explaining to people to the Quran, which we must do because the Quran is all about oneness?
Yeah, I think the thing that people find most, the thing that some people find most difficult about this whole venture of mine is putting the texts alongside each other and not using one to judge the other in either direction. And I can do that because my perspective is pretty liberal. I'm not evangelical, not an evangelical Christian, although I used to be. So I put the scriptures next to each other and they can have a conversation together. And I think that's what God intended. Because
we say here's another really nice phrase, Wallahu alam. Allah knows best.
Yes, exactly.
If we ever say that that's what Allah intended, we can put ourselves in a bit of difficulty because he knows what he intended and we don't. Okay. So Wallahu alam. That's a really nice one.
Okay. But the reason I say that is because the Quran is frequently, habitually referring to the other and the previous revelations. And it's saying these stories are in there. So when you're talking about fuller details in the Quran, yes, there's extra details. Most of the accounts have got extra details in them. But also, apart from Surah Yusuf and the mentions of Moses and the stories of Moses. So the story of Moses in the Quran is quite long, but it's in lots of different places. Adam and Eve, Ibrahim. Those stories are there, and you can see the biblical bits, and you can see the bits which are just Quranic. But for the others, so take Job, Ayub, in the Quran. There's just, I think there's about 4 verses which talk about Job. It's quite a long book in the Bible. The Quran doesn't need to tell the whole story of Job, because if you want to know, even if you're a Muslim, you want to know the story of Job, you can go and pick up a Bible. It's not going to be dangerous for you. You won't become a Jew or a Christian just because you've read the book of Job and you're a Muslim. And there is this, there's a relationship, there's some interdependence between the 2 books. And one really interesting example is in, I can't remember where it is, obviously, there's a lot of verses, but there is an actual quote from a psalm in the Quran, and the Quran actually says that this is a quote. It's the only time when that happens. So there's a link.
Well, where is that? Can you, if you could maybe post below later on, so if we find that, that's very, very interesting. That's yes. So just jot it down, and inshallah we'll have it put below.
Inshallah, we'll see if we can find it.
We'll take a look at that. That would be great.
But you're asking me about Tawheed and the whole question of Trinity. Yeah. So people have approached it from different perspectives. So this is Christian scholars of the Quran, proper academics, people who speak and read Arabic. So a good example would be, I've forgotten his name now, Bishop of Jerusalem at one point.
Oh gosh, he's got glasses, right? Riyadh, is it Riyadh?
No, much before that. Anyway, might come back to me. So
write that one down too. Bishop of Jerusalem, everyone. The current Jerusalem, yeah.
Right. Ken something. So he and other people would say that when it talks about Christian beliefs and it talks about the Trinity and it talks about this idea of Mary being part of the Godhead, that these are actually what we would call Christian heresies, different groups who are not fully orthodox in the widest sense within Christianity, and therefore the Quran is in those places referring to that. And obviously there's still an issue with the incarnation and the deity of Christ, but that when it makes specific mentions of these things which are unacceptable from a Quranic point, like Allah being the Messiah, because that's actually the wrong way around. That's what it's referring to, things which were not right, but that doesn't give a full answer. And I think that there's a lack of appreciation, and this extends into Christianity amongst Christians, of why people actually do believe in the Trinity. So it was a doctrine which was written down in the Creed, and it took time to develop. So more complicated than Tawheed, obviously.
It is
there are doctrines and beliefs in Islam, like the whether there's an eternal Quran with God, for example, things like that, which there was a lot of arguing about over a long period of time.
But I will say, but what I will say is that is actually almost a side issue. The oneness is there, it's pivotal, okay. It's understood. Whereas the Trinity is now central to modern Christianity in the way that Tawheed is eternally central to Islam.
This is where we need to rewind. So the reason the idea or the doctrine of the Trinity emerged is people trying to make sense of how they encountered Jesus and how they understood him. So on my blog, and there's hundreds of blogs on there are a couple about incarnation and Trinity. And the Trinity, the belief in the Trinity is rooted in the idea of Jesus being the incarnate Son of God. So once you have this idea of Jesus as being God in some way, without going into any details, then you've got to have some framework to make sense of this, because from a traditional Jewish Tawhid perspective, it didn't work. But clearly they had, at an early stage, a belief in Jesus as divine. And that became the key building block for what later became the doctrine of the Trinity, creating this new word which didn't exist previously. And I'm not an apologist for the Trinity, but in terms of both the biblical text and the history of the early church, the writings of the early church fathers, I think there were some early church mothers, but not many. Well, not as famous. And the creeds, then it does flow. And you can say something went wrong at some place, but it wasn't something artificial that was invented 300 years later. There is a path.
You focus a lot on your writings, and everybody, you can look at these on Twitter, particularly. It's the hashtag how to read the Quran. You focus a lot on love. Obviously, Allah Ta'ala is Al-Wadud, and he has 99 beautiful names. And some of those are specifically about love and creativity and bringing human beings into their flowering closeness to Allah. And others are a warning. Now, where Christianity is, no, I wouldn't say Christianity. I'd say what was your nervousness about encountering, or did you have a nervousness about encountering Allah as he is in his strength and his might? Because we can draw, lots of comments about the loving Allah for sure, and they're missing from this dialogue now. And what your Twitter line and what your blog is filling is a big gap. How do you encounter Allah, who is the majestic, the constrictor, the mighty? And how do you explain that in your work to Christians?
Okay, so when you say mighty, majestic, and all the others, are you linking that with the sort of the divine judgment side, or not?
The powerful, and questioning and judging of humanity. Because of course we have a new evangelical moment right now, and some of these churches in America, for example, and they say all you have to say is I believe in Jesus and you're going to heaven, which is a fast track. Some might say to leaving behind good behaviors. And whereas in Islam we understand the good behavior is very much linked into your right to access heaven.
Okay, I think there's more than one thing there. I don't know if you want to focus on the more philosophical and how I engage with the ways in which God is represented, or popular belief.
I think I want us to know how you encounter personally on opening the Quran, the wider remit of Allah.
Yes. So what I have difficulty with, and I have difficulty with this in both the Bible and the Quran, is the idea of judgment and hell as usually understood. And there are different perspectives on it in both Christianity and Islam. There's a whole spectrum, from the real hardliners who say only a few will get to paradise, to the really universalist types who will say, well, everyone will be restored in the end. So interestingly, from my my various readings, Ibn Taymiyyah. So some people trace ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Wahhabis, Salafis, Khawarij earlier, back to Ibn Taymiyyah and say he is the root of hardline extremism. And apologies to any of those groups where anything's been misrepresented. So he did have some hard opinions on some things, but one of the things that he wrote about was this idea of a universalist outcome in the end, that people would go to hell, but eventually God would take them out of it. And I was reading recently about one of his followers, whose name I've forgotten, who picked up on these ideas, but then had to retract them because the religious establishment had such difficulty with this universalist idea. But within the tradition, I think it's in the Quran as well, my mercy overcomes my wrath, or words to that effect. And also within the Christian tradition, Mother Julian of Norwich, I read her Revelations of Divine Love recently. So she was in there was only Catholic Christianity in England at that time. She was basically a hermit. She had these revelations, visions. One of the key ones, was that she saw God's hand, and in God's hand was a hazelnut. And she understood that that hazelnut was the whole of creation being tenderly held by God. And she talked about everything being well. Now, I think she was constrained by the church, and she doesn't go for the full universalist idea, but she's heading in that direction. And that's how I approached the text. So anything which is talking about wrath and judgment and hellfire, as we are familiar with in our traditions, instantly puts me off. But within the Sufi traditions, then it will say things like, these are illustrations and warnings, and these are the places that we put ourselves into, and God is completely loving. So you were talking about the 99 names.
So I think we're going, because we're a bit short on time. What I'd love to know is, finally, just two more questions, is what has the Quran done to your heart? How do you feel when you sit with it, and what are Muslims missing out on if we don't access it every day or complete it in Ramadan? What is it to you?
Yes, so my experience of reading the Quran is like reading the Bible, and I can feel that there's a divine message coming through, and there's lots of lovely bits in it which I probably tweeted recently. So the one about God being closer than your jugular vein. So God is right within each of us, and that's not what people associate with Islam. And I know even some Muslims, they're not big on that idea of God being intimately close to us.
Intimately close is different to within us. But anyway, we can talk about this.
But we are all within
very
God.
Close, very close indeed, interacting at every moment.
And the names of God, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the most kind, the most caring. Apart from the beginning of Surah 9, you read that each time you start a new surah. That is what it's about, and that is really pushed home. And Al-Wadud, which appears in there, and the typical English Christian, post-Christian, Christian heritage person will not appreciate the text because it doesn't fit with their Christian perceptions. They judge it against the Bible or against the New Testament. And if you look at Surah 93, which is God talking directly to the Prophet Muhammad and say, didn't we find you an orphan? Lots of tender conversations. Yeah, it is very moving, and particularly in groups. So I go to a Mev Levy Zikr group, meditation, prayers, recitations, chanting, sharing the Quranic readings and Rumi and reflecting together. Very, very moving. And in an ideal world, we would all come together, we would all read our texts together, we would all pray together, we would have great encounters and would be moved. Or as in my Christian tradition, Methodist, John Wesley talked about his heart being strangely warmed. I think we would find our hearts being strangely warmed together. And I think, mindful of what you said earlier, God knows best, that is God's intention, that we sit and we pray and we read together.
MashaAllah. Thank you so much, Julian Bond. I will end with this, brothers and sisters in faith and in humanity. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. But is it not sufficient concerning your Lord that he is over all things a witness? SubhanAllah. Let's sit together. Let's understand our traditions. Let's make sure we connect with the scripture. And may we pray. And we certainly pray for you to continue bringing out these beautiful lights and to be guided on your path with the brightest of all lights. Thanks a lot, Julian. And thanks a lot, brothers and sisters in faith and humanity. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.